So, welcome back to the next part as we talk about qualitative data. I'm going to start in this lecture with talking about observations. Observations are a really basic tool for the qualitative researcher. It is really hard to do any kind of qualitative research without making observations. These observations end up being very comprehensive, detailed, and often happen for a prolonged or extended period of time. Usually, observations are unstructured, although, depending on the research question, they may follow a protocol or an established pattern, almost a checklist of what to look for. And those kinds of observations tend to follow what's called a protocol. And you would be trained to use that protocol in observing in the classroom. I've talked before about the role of the researcher in qualitative research. Remember, it's a continuum from a really totally detached, I'm just perched here on a chair observing what happens and hopefully the participants are ignoring me, all the way along the continuum to where I'm participating. So perhaps I'm the teacher and making these observations in the ebb and flow of the classroom to answer my research question. In an observation, you are recording both verbal and nonverbal events as well, and it's often the researcher has to make observations trying to get at the tacit understanding of the group that aren't as explicit or as obvious, but get at why this is happening, and it's kind of hard to define or explain what's going on. Those are what we call those tacit, intangible, kind of making some inferences sometimes. Site selection is really important based on the research question. There will always be a gatekeeper granting access, and that is the person who either explicitly or implicitly allows permission or access. And I'm not necessarily talking about a principal or something like that. When you're observing a group, say a group of 4 students in a classroom, it's there. You will find that even in the group, there's a gatekeeper that either lets you in or the shoulders go up and the back gets turned to you, kind of thing. And you have to be kind of careful about the gatekeeper because some gatekeepers can grant access, but then they put up subtle hurdles and you're not really getting true access, whether that's a formal gatekeeper or an informal one. Before the observations start, it's really important to document that setting, and we call this mapping. And it's the social nuances, the grouping, the temporal relationships that are there. You want to fully document anything that could have an influence, such as race, age, gender, size of the room, the stuff on the walls, the time patterns or schedules, or what is the bell like? All of those things may be important, so you want to be sure that you record them. When you conduct an observation, the researcher really should start with a selection of the best site for what they need to find out. Then you start the actual mapping of the setting. And as I said before, this includes a social or a participant map with details about the makeup of the groups or what the person is like from what you can see. The space is mapped or described in detail, and even if it doesn't seem obviously important at the outset. And finally, you describe and diagram out the events, the timelines, the sequences, the patterns of the events. Then you should determine your sample. And you look for a sample that will get you the best information and knowledge about whatever it is you're trying to study. Sometimes, especially in case studies, researchers skip this step of selecting a site and then choosing a sample. But this misses out on whether the case study is actually the most useful sample. But quite honestly, with case studies, a researcher is usually very interested in the uniqueness of a specific individual. Data collection is always bound by your resources. How long can you really afford to keep observing and taking down notes? And sometimes it's even bound by a natural calendar, like a semester. So The more data you can collect, the better, but there's always going to be a limit, unless you're Margaret Mead or Jane Goodall and that becomes your life's work, I guess. Field observations are incredibly detailed. It is amazing to look at a good qualitative researcher's notes. As much as possible, the observer captures everything that could be useful. I but sometimes there's different structures that are used. For example, I participated in a study not long ago in which I was looking at one particular student, kind of a case study situation, and I had a 5 minute timer vibrating in my pocket. So every 5 minutes when that timer went off, I would watch what the student was doing and record what I was seeing. So basically, I had 5 minutes to write down in my notes. And then the next time the timer went off in my pocket, I wrote down what I saw next. So it was done in 5 minute increments. Most often, we try to record also so that we've got an auditory record if it's at all possible. Sometimes you're actually able to make a video recording, but that's often very obtrusive in a classroom. The kids want to perform as soon as they see a camera going. And researchers who do a good job with video use it so much that the kids finally get used to it and start ignoring the camera. At the end, you don't just do the observation, walk out of the classroom, and then the next day you come back and start the observation again. Really good researchers find it incredibly useful to sit somewhere quiet after the observation and use that opportunity to capture general impressions or things that stood out or questions that came up, because it's amazing. If you don't do that, your observations start to blur very quickly, day by day, and it's a very powerful strategy. When Another way of collecting data is with documents and artifacts. And these are especially important for background information or information about the setting. For example, when I'm doing classroom observations for a study of some kind or a project, I often ask for the teacher's lesson plan because this does a lot to give me background information on what is being done and what is supposed to be happening. And sometimes the lesson plan can let me anticipate even where to sit or what I should be looking for or what I can kind of expect. Another common artifact is student work. If I'm observing, for example, how a group of fourth graders interact to solve a math problem, it's going to be really incredibly valuable for me to have a copy of their work. So I may want to snap a photo of their whiteboard or take a copy of their paper or something, because then I can go back with my notes and look at the processes that they went through. And I can triangulate what I observed with the actual working of the problems. Artifacts and documents are usually static. In other words, unless I use them as part of the interview process and pull them out and ask questions, which can also be really a valuable strategy, I'm trying to use them either as backup for what I observed or to better understand what I observed. So very often they become secondary data sources. And that's why they're usually supplementary, even though I've seen some really interesting studies that started with student work. That can be very revealing, especially if a student is writing or working through some kind of process. Almost anything you can gather becomes an artifact in a qualitative research study. Sometimes you want very personal documents that give insight into a person's perspective. During a project, I gathered reflections from the participants at the end of each week. These artifacts, these documents were so valuable as I started to understand their attitudes and where they were struggling and what was most interesting to them, and even why they were involved in this project became very, very valuable. Often a researcher will have access to more official kinds of artifacts, such as department meeting minutes or lesson plans. Sometimes you can get as official as going to student and HR records or files. If I'm doing a case study, for example, and observing one or two children who are unique in some way, Looking through their CUME files can provide me insight from psychologists, their previous teachers, their parents, etc. The big question there is, should I look at the file before or after I do my observations? And I don't know that I've got an answer for that. It could either send you in one direction, or it might be best to wait until the end and then go back and see what's in that CUME file. Often we look at statistical things like the test scores or the grades of those we're observing for the same reasons. And last of all, symbols can be an important artifact. This is totally unprofessional, but I'm doing an unofficial study of the doodling of two different colleagues who end up beside me in every meeting lately. It just fascinates me, and I have all kinds of explanations running through my brain about what they doodle because they're so different in their patterns. But on a more useful note, a lot of research is done in today's world with student artwork, doodling, drawings, and graffiti. These can reveal a lot about perspectives and culture. There are some other supplementary techniques that tend to get used mostly with observations or interviews. These aren't used as often because they tend to impact the group, the participants, or they're very, very difficult to do. So, for example, video. As I mentioned before, video, it can be incredibly useful, but it can also be very, very obtrusive, as people tend to perform for a camera. And there are analyses that are nonverbal analyses. So, um, studies of what a child is doing and how they move and their patterns as they move around the room, especially for some special needs children or some autistic children. A lot can be gained about what the child may be trying to do from their movements and their body language. There are special surveys that get used, and then I've talked before about focus groups, which I personally love focus groups. They are so valuable for understanding as you record the give and take in the group.